Last month, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi met with Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull to discuss India potentially joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a free trade agreement amongst many nations like Japan, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and several Southeast Asian nations like Malaysia and Vietnam. However, as the New York Times explains on March 15, 2018, Modi showed up late to the meeting because, and I quote, he was too emotional after watching Titanic for the first time. Indeed, it looks like India's chance for free trade agreement has hit an iceberg. At the same time, as the Wall Street Journal explains on April 2nd of 2018, there is another threat on the rise in Asia. China, as their growing economic and political hegemony has caused much institutional fear amongst many nations, some of which are TPP member states. Now, India has long served as a check on China's increasing influence in the region. And as the East-West Institute for Asian Policy Research articulates on March 31st, 2018, by allowing India to join the TPP, it may actually allow India to serve as an even better check against China's growing influence in the region, making it critical that we ask ourselves today's question. Should the TPP target India for membership to counter Chinese hegemony in Asia? And the answer is clearly yes, because India will provide a strong counter on Chinese influence in three critical ways. First, by becoming a strong export market for many Southeast Asian nations. Second, by providing maritime balance. And finally, by expanding their own political influence. Now, the first reason why the TPP should definitely target India in order to counter China's increasing hegemony in the region is because by allowing them to join the TPP, India will serve as a strong export market for many Southeast Asian nations. This has been a huge problem as of late. In fact, The Economist explains on March 31st of 2018 that back in 1989, China signed an agreement with both Malaysia and Vietnam, and several other Southeast Asian nations have glommed on in recent years, which essentially says that these nations' natural resource markets, which are their largest markets, will be almost exclusively given to China in exchange for incredibly cheap imports. As a result, as the Peterson Institute for International Economics explains on March 21st of 2018, China now has 80% of the export market for both Malaysia and Vietnam. But this is exactly where India comes into play. As was explained by the Washington Post on March 18th of 2018, because India can now serve as an effective import market for many of these Southeast Asian nations, because they have a shortage of many of these natural resources, particularly nickel and copper, with which both Malaysia and Vietnam are rich in, by allowing them to join the TPP, many of these Southeast Asian nations will begin to look towards India, not just China. As a result, China's influence will begin to wane as India's influence waxes, making it clear that by allowing them to join the TPP, India will provide a sound check on China. But don't worry about it, I heard there's going to be a second final. But the second reason why the TPP should definitely target India in order to join is ultimately because they will provide a check on China in terms of maritime balance. Now, as Parag Khanna, director of the Global Governance Initiative, explains in his book, How to Run the World, 70% of all global trade is carried out via the seas, meaning that the sea medium is by far the most viable alternative for trade practices. And China has a huge stronghold on this market within Southeast Asia. In fact, as was explained by The Hill on January 13th of 2018, what's great about China, if you're Chinese, is the fact that they control nearly 40% of the maritime passages in order for trade to exist. And so whenever a Southeast Asian nation has tried to trade through those mediums, they've had to pay a substantial fine. But this is where India comes into play. The Council on Foreign Relations articulates on March 12th of 2018 that while China controls 40%, India controls 35%. And then as a result, India will provide a great check on many of these trade imbalances within the region. And we've already seen this come into play. A case in point, the New York Times explains on March 21st of 2018 that after China tried to barter through one of India's own maritime passages, the Indian Navy blocked them, meaning that China's influence will continue to wane if we allow them to join the TPP, because more and more TPP member states will be able to trade via the seas for a much cheaper cost. But the final reason why the TPP should absolutely allow India to join in order to check China is ultimately because of their growing political influence in the region as a result. This is perhaps the largest problem when it comes to Chinese hegemony today. In fact, as was explained by the New York Times on March 20th of 2018, China in several different instances has forced many TPP member states to succumb to their own political ideologies, most notably Vietnam, because they have such a strong economic hold on these nations. And they complied. But this is exactly where India comes into play. For as the Brookings Institution explains on March 8th of 2018, India serves as a great example of democracy within the region. And, as the article goes on to explain, the TPP can serve as an amazing political check as well. Because when two nations have a strong economic relationship, that automatically leads to a strong political relationship, because they want mutual stability. By allowing India to join the TPP, their democratic principles will begin to spread into many of these Southeast Asian nations, providing a substantial check on China, and ultimately making sure that democracy flows throughout Asia. So when we return to today's question, should the TPP target India for membership to counter Chinese hegemony in Asia? The answer is absolutely. They will be an effective check on China's increasing influence in three critical ways. First, in terms of natural resource exports. Second, in terms of maritime balance. And finally, in terms of political influence. Once Narendra Modi decides that India should join the TPP, then he can finally pull a Titanic and shout, "I'm the king of the world."